So John's Gospel, from which we get our scripture reading this morning, is distinctive in many ways. It's poetic style, it's mystical theology, it's sort of peculiar plot points. Unlike the other three Gospels, which are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they share kind of a similar shape or synopsis. John skips all kinds of familiar stories and then adds in a few others that appear nowhere else, like, for instance, this one. Now, the book of John, you may remember, it doesn't begin with Christmas. There's no birth narrative at all. Instead, it opens with that famous prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The prologue is followed by what scholars call the Book of Signs, and today's reading is the first of those signs, a wedding in Cana, water turned marvelously into wine, just in time. Let's listen together for the Spirit to speak from the Gospel of John, chapter 2. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." But his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now, draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Will you pray with me? Christ, our teacher, you reach into our lives not through instruction or doctrine, but through story. Open our hearts to being attentive, that seeing we may perceive, and hearing we may understand, and understanding our very lives might be transformed. Amen. They have no wine. They have no wine, and the night was just getting started. They hadn't even cut the cake. Maybe they weren't even done with the toasts, the result of poor planning on somebody's part. Maybe someone never tallied up the RSVPs quite right, or lots of people brought +1s, like Jesus, for instance, who apparently brought plus at least 4 disciples. Maybe that's why they ran out. Disciples and ancient day wedding crashers. After all, these are the guys who brought us the practice of communion, so we know that, they like their wine. Whoever's fault it was, when the wine does give out, Mary knows time is up. It's time. Time for the young adult Jesus to, as Molly was saying, step into his power and his gifts to meet the need that has presented itself. Probably my favorite definition of vocation or call, some of you may know, is from the writer Frederick Buechner, who says, "God calls you to the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Well, the hunger, or in this case the thirst, has arisen, but Jesus isn't exactly glad to be called upon. I love the relatable mother-son interchange between Jesus and Mary here. There's so much said in so little, such economy of language. Simply, they have no wine. And the snarky reply, "What concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." He doesn't think the timing is right. Perhaps Jesus is waiting for what he thought was the right moment. Maybe he imagined his miraculous public debut would come in some high-profile healing or, a preaching in the temple. Nothing so frivolous as a poorly planned party. But divine timing is less about the right moment as it is about the ripe moment. If we wait for the right or the perfect moment, we'll never begin at all. It's never really the right time to start something new, is it? It's never really the convenient time to fall in love or have a child or create your art or rise up in a movement. The right moment is an illusion. But instead, if we are both patient and then decisive, we are gifted from God, I believe, the ripe moment, that sweet, pivotal kairos moment that happens in God's time. But, like that wily avocado on your kitchen counter, it can be hard to know just when the ripe moment has arrived. Things might feel hard to the touch one moment, unready, unyielding, and then brown and squishy the next. With a mere failure of nerve, we can miss that ripe moment altogether and wind up with rotten fruit. That's why we need Mary in this story. Mary, who turns to the servants and says plainly, "Do whatever he tells you." I love Mary here. She is both direct and self-differentiated. By naming the moment, she urges Jesus, her son, to step up and into his power, but she doesn't force him into anything. She doesn't even out him without his consent. She nudges him with some edge, but then she lets go, lets him figure it out for himself. I think it's pretty good parenting of adult children right there. Sometimes parenting love, or that nudging love that I think is shared in many relationships, can look like the slow gestational growth, like the baby Jesus coming into being in what the book of Galatians calls the fullness of time. But sometimes that edgy, nudging love looks a little more like a deadline. Not the fullness of time, but the nick of time. In his recent book, published last year, called When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing, writer Daniel H. Pink synthesizes a lot of cutting-edge research from a variety of disciplines, all on timing: biology, psychology, economics. And he uses the science of timing to describe things like why you should avoid going to the hospital in the afternoon if you can help it, why singing in time with other people is as good for you as exercise. Nice little choir plug, yeah. And maybe my favorite chapter, all about the science of timing the perfect nap, including the so-called nappuccino, downing a cup of coffee approximately 25 minutes before you awake from your nap, just as the caffeine is hitting your bloodstream. Timing, in all kinds of realms in our experience, is everything, is decisive. It's all in the timing, as any good comedian or athlete can tell you. And so too for us as people of faith, listening for God's call in our lives, it doesn't just matter what we do with our one wild and precious life, but when we do it. Cultural movements, too, yearning and urging us collectively towards greater justice, equality, repentance, must contend with this tricky issue of timing and urgency. As the protest chants puts it, it's not just about what do we want? Freedom? I don't know. Yeah, that works. But also, when do we want it? Now. The when is as important as the what. This weekend, we remember and celebrate the profound legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we also celebrate all those who worked with and alongside and behind the scenes with him. I think it is fitting, given the story about the right and ripe moment, fitting to recall that in King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, written to 8 white, cautious clergy who had criticized King's nonviolent resistance against segregation as, I quote, unwise and untimely. They said to him, wait. They said to him, your hour is not yet come. And King responds with the height of his prophetic eloquence. Here's King. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed, according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. King continues later, there comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of injustice, where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. I think the key to King's prophetic genius was held right there in the way he articulated the present urgency of racial injustice. Time's up. It seems no coincidence, speaking of timing, that it was just in 2017, as women around the country rose up marching against the person and policies epitomized by our assaulter-in-chief. Think of that first Women's March, the largest single-day protest in U.S. history in 2017. It's no coincidence that that same year, 2017, also later gave birth to a popularization, sort of the viralness of the hashtag #MeToo movement. Important to note that Me Too had been around for a while, had been around for almost a decade, founded by founder Tarana Burke. But something about the timeliness, the synchronicity of that Me Too movement in 2017, grounded in women bravely sharing stories online of sexual violence that they have endured, gained a different kind of traction. And out of the Me Too empowerment movement came a related movement called Time's Up. Their tagline is, "The clock has run out on sexual assault, harassment, and equality in the workplace. It's time to do something about it." And they focus on concrete change, specifically legislation and policies leading to safety, equity, and opportunity in the workplace, particularly for women in low-wage industries and women of color. Now, there's also some frustration that it took, in some ways, a lot of white women to bring the movement to a different kind of exposure. And none of this is new, of course. There's nothing new against violence and inequity against women. None of this is new. I think of the resounding response of many people of color who were reminded shocked liberal white folks after Trump's election that none of this is new. And yet for some of us, there's an exposure that's happening in a new way. The clock is running out, people are saying, but now what? Sometimes it feels like we're living in an extended moment of ripeness that is in danger of festering. It's been over a year since the Me Too movement exploded online and throughout our wider culture, but toxic masculinity is hardly an endangered species. Simply call to mind the Kavanaugh hearings and Dr. Blasey Ford's brave testimony. Or just this week, maybe you saw the Gillette commercial, calling out this phenomenon of toxic masculinity that's nothing new, and urging men instead to be their best, to dismantle the old boys will be boys system of structural violence, which predictably caused, let's say, a mixed response on the internet, including that very special brand of rage that comes from, I think, male chauvinists behind a computer screen. Time has been up for a while, but I wonder if instead of, which we could criticize the Gillette ad if you've seen it, or you can Google it afterwards, as maybe plugging into the sort of the commercialization of, quote, wokeness, or doing some virtue signaling, like we're on the right side. I wonder that if at the moment when corporations start to see that time is up, I think maybe that's a good sign. For as King also wrote in that letter from the Birmingham jail, lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but, King continues, as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. I was reminded of this yesterday when I sat down and tried to stomach the video that was going viral yesterday, the infamous mob mentality of American racism, which the civil rights movement so geniusly exposed, was horribly reincarnated this weekend in a crowd of jeering white MAGA hat-wearing high school boys in D.C. who had come to take part of the March for Life. Perhaps you saw that footage. It showed a group of jeering high school boys near the Lincoln Memorial, surrounding a Native American elder, a veteran named Nathan Phillips, at the end of the Indigenous Peoples March. Nathan Phillips beats his drum steadily, with quiet dignity, as the boys taunt and smirk, chanting, "Build the wall," to Indigenous people, the cruelty both disgusting and absurd. This horrible clip captured for me kind of a contemporary moment of what the theorist Hannah Arendt, talking about the Holocaust, dubbed the banality of evil. The banality. Sadly, there's nothing exceptional about these boys. They have been taught the same white supremacist toxic masculinity of dominance and violence, bred for it. They gleefully quote the president, whose administration, I would say, is governing in the opposite of ripe moments, whose current tantrum has dragged on and festered the longest shutdown in U.S. government history. I found myself wondering, where were their chaperones, their parents? Where was the equivalent of Mary saying, "Time's up"? Even Jesus, God incarnate in human form, needed a Mary, someone to show some fierce, challenging, mothering love. We all need that mothering love, biological or otherwise, to nudge us to the edge of our sinfulness, of the systems of oppression we all participate in, nudge us to the edge so we can leap off and fly. Or expose us to the reality, the mess, so we can step up and play our part. That kind of fierce, mothering love was gathered in droves and power at women's marches across the country and right here in the East Bay yesterday, with members of our own community marching and rolling with the disabled contingent in Oakland. I loved seeing images of our group and others all around the country, women and people of all genders. These are very serious things people are protesting, and yet in all the pictures I see big, luminous smiles. So too, I thought of the Indigenous elder Nathan Phillips in that video. He was not just silent, but he was rooted in his own spiritual grounding, beating his drum, and singing. Singing. Because, okay, and this is my last point here, so stay with me. It's no accident, symbolically in this story, Jesus' first sign, his first miracle, it takes place at a party, a wedding. Even as we are called to step up and name the systems and scourges of injustice, the rotting systems, we have to keep hold of our joy. You have kept the good wine until now, the steward says. Not just a little bit of joy, but 6 stone water jars in the story, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. That's the equivalent of 180 gallons of wine. Picture a fish tank the size of the communion table. Jesus uses what he has, repurposing the ritual water jugs that were used for purification, and transforms the tools of purification into those of celebration. So too, we in the church today, we get to use what we have. These strange stories of miracles we don't always know what to make of, these big containers of ritual, and then we are called to transform and reclaim them anew. You have kept the good wine until now. The better wine, friends, is coming. For the calling of the Christian life, the way of Jesus, the way of liberation and healing work of all kinds, it's a long game. You have kept the good wine until now, requiring both deep spiritual patience of our forebears and the urgent impatience unleashed in decisive kairos, ripe moments. For the way of Jesus is not just about doing the right thing at the right time, but when time's up, seizing the ripe moment and unleashing the inherent sweetness of life. Thanks be to God. Amen.